the narrative is basically saying that Apple hasn't just trained up its suppliers and created a problem for itself. It's created a problem for the United States, if not the West, if not the entire world. The number of people Apple has trained since 2008 is 28 million. That's larger than the labor force of California. It's probably larger than the labor force of Canada. It is difficult to fathom how influential this company was.
Do you think that this is the start of a new political sensitivity towards North American industrialization or reindustrialization? Is this going to be part of our politics going forward?
So you don't have to be anti-China, you don't have to be anti-CCP just to understand the mere power and size of China represents a massive threat to the trading system that we set up over the last 80 years.
It's a story that affects our planet, and it's a brilliant one. Patrick McGee is the author of Apple in China, the capture of the world's greatest company. And I must say, I'm just so honored to have him here. He's fresh off, I think, Jon Stewart's show and Scott Galloway's show, and now, of course, Brave New Something. It just flows naturally. There we go.
Speaking up that mountain.
So, Patrick, thank you for being here.
My
And
pleasure.
I must say, what a title and what a thesis to this book. I mean, anyone who hasn't heard of this book has to get it now, has to listen to it if that's how you ingest these things, or just get the hardcover, read through this because oh my goodness, what a brilliant work. And maybe we can start with just a general question, a freebie before we kind of delve into the issues. Maybe you could tell our audience why you use the word capture, because I think that really is at the heart of the book.
I use the word capture because I think Apple, at an operational level, has become so successful that its success is its vulnerability. And it's become so successful by making investments in one country above all else over the last quarter century. And the result of that partnership with China is just unprecedented, unparalleled scale, quality, cost. And they will not be able to move to India, to America, to Mexico, to any place else. So they're captured by China in the sense that the supply chain there is basically permanent. And even if you said, oh, give them a magic wand, they could build this in India, Apple would still be kind of stuck because they have a $70 billion business in China. And so they risk the ire of Beijing putting up obstacles for their developments in India, but they also risk the ire of Chinese consumers who are increasingly nationalist. And right now, it is a nationalist impulse to purchase an iPhone. The Chinese rightfully see the iPhone as an indigenous product. If Apple becomes the poster child of Western corporate de-risking from China, it's a whole different ballgame. So that's why they're captured. I steal a metaphor from Henry Kissinger. This isn't in the book, but that Westerners, when they're conceiving of war or strategy, they're conceiving of a chess-like move where you go after the king and you knock over the king. The Chinese don't play chess, they play Go. And in Go, you encircle your enemy until they're out of options and they just give up. And unfortunately, that is where I see Tim Cook and Apple right now.
Just absolutely fascinating. Actually, my final question to you today that I had planned for was to actually ask you about whether or not they would be successful in moving into other markets, such as India and others, because your book at the end actually deals with the diversification efforts that were made in that regard. And let me ask you, separate and apart from the blowback that would take place in China, is it possible for Apple to do what it did in China? And just to bring the listeners up to speed, I mean, you go into this in detail where there were $50 billion investments per year building up industries that supported the Chinese manufacturing base and became really bedrock backbone of the Chinese manufacturing base. Can they do that again? Do they have, was that a one-off? Is that a possibility if they're ready to accept the blowback from China?
Yeah, so this is where I actually give massive credit to China. I don't think Apple necessarily recognizes the degree to which China was a once in a century partner. It's not just that they built factories and had tens of millions of workers who could come over from the migrant areas only for temporary periods at a time, accept low wages of labor, and do it for 12 hours a day. That's critical, but the Chinese state, through a sort of federalism on steroids kind of program, right? Soviet communism and Chinese communism are very, very different. This is the key respect. The cadres are incentivized at the local level. So there's lots of competition between Suzhou and Hangzhou, etc. Um, where was I going with that? I feel like I've lost my train of thought somehow.
Well, well, you know what? It strikes me
The
that
industrial clusters and okay, yeah, sorry. It's not just the industrial clusters. It's the 8-lane highways between them. It's the high-speed rail between them. It is the I think 22 different ports that China has. So basically, no other country in the world has the same size, right? The only one is India, because even though Vietnam has the skill, they don't have the same geographic diversification. If it's rainy in Vietnam, it's basically raining across the whole country. That's just not true in China. So you can
right.
sort of diversify your shipment and logistics if you get to that state. India is the only country that has the same, ballpark density, ballpark population, ballpark size, but they don't have the same Nietzschean will to power where the whole national prowess is based on one sector, which is manufacturing. The epigraph to the book is without manufacturing, there is no country, there is no nation. And it's a Beijing 2015 document. No other country thinks that way. And until you think that way, you're not going to compete with China. It's like a grade 7 person hoping to compete against LeBron James in basketball. Well, I guess if you do nothing but play basketball 8 hours a day and you have the size and strength of LeBron James, but most people are never going to get to that level, and nobody is practicing, the sport of manufacturing the way that China is.
Right, of course. And I guess that really gets back to the point that you were bringing up of Go versus chess, right? I mean, this is all born of direct intention and planning. And what I found fascinating about your book was how you actually you not only took us through how things were formed in China and how this relationship was formed, but you showed what the effects were. And to your point about Go, it's very interesting because when a North American thinks about China, they think about the joint venture model, the one we've heard so much about. Countries that kind of move in, or companies that move in, and they find a local partner. And the purpose of the local partner, it's understood, is to affect the technology transfer, learn the ways of things, and there you go. But Apple was different. Apple was the first of quite a few companies now that ultimately moved in and didn't form a joint venture, but rather became almost a professor, became a learned mentor for others to follow. And in doing so, managed to build up an industry. And the interesting, and I'm speaking a lot about this, but I'm very interested to get your opinion. The interesting thing about that is what transpired once they did that. Apple became the world leader for sure. And then with time, bettered all of the manufacturing prowess around it. And what we're seeing in China is that Apple has fallen now to a distant fourth place because it has trained its competitors in the skill sets necessary to develop Apple like products. Similarly with Tesla, Tesla enters into China. It acts as a mentor for the EV market, and it is now the fourth of the car companies in China. And of course, they are now massively scaling to develop and sell this to the world. So you can be a leader for a while, but they have a very purposeful outcome in making you the leader, which is to learn from the best. That the game of Go that you think has been played?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So let me see if I can just put it in sort of narrative terms because I think a lot of the conclusions that you were drawing there could be probably felt by other from other books, or certainly experts in the field know this kind of stuff. The value of my book is sort of getting the layperson up to speed by just teaching them how this happened through the sexy lens of Apple and Apple products, so that you're not having to read sort of academic histories of supply chain management or China or great power politics to get there. So I think you can get to the same place, but it's through like a fast-paced narrative but from all these Apple executives and engineers who are trying their best to make world-leading products and largely succeeding, oblivious to what it means to train up all of these suppliers to meet their demands, not quite realizing that they're creating their own competition. And the reviews of the book that have really got it best, because this is really, I mean, if you've read the book, you know that the tone is very neutral. It is not a polemic. It is not a screed. And so I never spell this out exactly, but reviewers like in the New York Times have understood that the narrative is basically saying that Apple hasn't just trained up its suppliers and created a problem for itself. It's created a problem for the United States, if not the West, if not the entire world. That is not what you expect when you read a corporate history. It is certainly not what I expected to get to when I was writing a corporate history. I mean, I eventually make the comparison between Apple investments into Chinese factories with the Marshall Plan. Trust me, I was not thinking that like that is not in the book pitch. That was when I realized just how gargantuan the investments were, and then having to compare it to other corporate investments and realizing nothing comes close, and so having to go to government efforts instead, and indeed nation building efforts. And the Marshall Plan I thought was going to be good because we all have some background, maybe in grade nine, social studies or something, reading about this, so it resonates. But I wasn't thinking that the math was going to check out, and the math was that Apple was investing twice the annual sum of the annual spending in the Marshall Plan, and the Marshall Plan was in 16 countries. Apple's investments, the Cook Plan, if you will, was in one, and it's not in a variety of industries like agriculture and food aid and building highways. It's in the advanced electronics sector, which is fundamental to how China sees its power, right? China views things like finance and software, internet as fictitious industries, whereas it views manufacturing and hard industries as the real economy. And we're so worried in the West sometimes that China might overtake America by GDP. And it's like, yeah, I don't think that's pretty arbitrary. Whereas their ability to scale electronics, drones, you think of the days of people calling Detroit the arsenal of democracy. China's already like leagues ahead in those regards in really disquieting ways. And so it's strange for an Apple history to go in that direction, but nobody had the influence that Apple had. And so the history of the book is really talking about how Steve Jobs comes back to the company to save it with a redesign of the aesthetics of a computer. And so Johnny Ive, the chief designer, is put in this like godlike position. And everybody knows what comes next, the translucent iMac, the iPod, the iPhone. And yet, even though we all have an understanding from other books, movies, Hollywood movies about Steve Jobs, of how maniacal and obsessive he was about this kind of stuff, we have failed to ask the question, what did it mean to take that culture and transplant it into China, an adversarial nation, and build those things in the hundreds of millions per year? This is why it's not a story about Apple exploiting China. It's a story about China exploiting Apple because the technology transfer was on a gargantuan scale.
The interesting word that you use there is exploiting, because exploiting indicates that someone has knowledge of themselves. It's an intention. It's born of intention, is exploiting. And what's very clear in your book is that Apple kind of fell ass backwards into this circumstance. It wasn't planned. It's just what made economic sense. But you highlight in your book a particular event where Apple realized that it needed to market itself better to Chinese officials. And three people, inclusive of Tim Cook, went over to China, to the Communist Party, through the gates of the sanctum of the Communist Party, and then made a pitch. This is perhaps a bit of an unfair question, but getting back to the intention, do you think China knew what it was doing from that point onward, or earlier or later? Do you think that China's interaction with Apple was born of intention? The intention that we see today?
Yeah, totally fair question. The answer is mostly no, but I'm glad it's not multiple choice because it deserves a little bit of unpacking. It is clear from documents from China in the 1980s onwards, under Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up period, that they are going to choose particular areas like Shenzhen, open to capitalist experimentation and open to foreign direct investment. And the whole point, just as you described the JV with China, is that the Chinese will learn, right? They'll be employed for starters, but they will also learn the tricks of the trade, right, of capitalism, and then create their own industries. And they become wildly successful in that, but in fairly low-grade industries in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. Then they really want to move up the value chain. You can't begrudge them for wanting to do this. This is what anyone would want to do in their right mind. So what I don't think they anticipated is that any corporation would ever play the role that Apple ends up playing, because Apple has this maddeningly intricate, no tolerance for defects culture, and they become immensely profitable and scale to such volumes that Apple indirectly employs 5 million people in the country. I mean, that's Tim Cook's number. 3 million people in manufacturing and 1.8 million app developers. The number of people Apple has trained since 2008 is 28 million. That's larger than the labor force of California. It's probably larger than the labor force of Canada. It is difficult to fathom how influential this company was. And if you're looking for like, well, give me the proof beyond, Apple revenue or Apple profit, one point would be that Apple only controls 20% of the global smartphone industry, but they reap 80 to 85% of the industry profit. Find me another sector where the numbers are remotely close to that. And this is for the defining product of the 21st century, right? Nothing comes close to the iPhone in terms of what represents the last 25 years in technology.
Right. And the industrial training that I heard you say, I mean, I'm going to paraphrase this a bit, but you had a great expression about Volkswagen versus Ferrari and what they were actually training for. Yeah, I think if I'm not mistaken, you said something to an audience that said, "Hey, they're not sitting there being trained to make 10 million Volkswagens. They're being trained to make 10 million Ferraris."
Yeah, I put this in car terms because it's easier to understand. So Samsung actually produces more phones than Apple. And so a lot of people say, well, is Samsung overly exposed to China? Like you keep saying you can't build these phones outside of China, but Samsung seems to do it. And that's partly true. Samsung has six major smartphone factories spanning Argentina to Vietnam, and they're not very exposed to China. I think it's 25 to 30% outsourcing, but otherwise they're building a lot of their own products at massive scale in Vietnam and in India in particular. But Samsung, even though you might think of it as the iPhone competitor that sells a Galaxy phone that costs $1,200, that costs $1,500, they're more like Volkswagen, where they do own within them a Porsche and an Audi, and they sell that, but most of the volumes are lower cost. So the average Android price globally is about $300, and Samsung plays a huge role in that market. Apple is only in the luxury space, where even the iPhone 16e, I think, costs $650, right? So more than double the price of the standard Android. And some of the iPhones go up to $1,600 or so when you spec them out with memory, right? So the average price, the ASP, if you will, the average selling price, is about $1,000. So you just sort of think of like this in car terms. Instead of them selling $30,000 cars, they're selling $100,000 cars. So it really is the difference between selling a bunch of, Volkswagen Golfs at the rate of 10 million a year versus selling 10 million Porsches, right? Which in the car industry, nobody does that. Porsche volumes, Ferrari volumes are very, very low. Apple, I mean, to quote Scott Galloway, he said this years ago, but it's a brilliant quote. He said, or he points out that Apple sells the equivalent of a luxury car, like the equivalent of a Lexus, but in Toyota volumes. And that's a great quote, and yet it understates it because the margins are higher than that of Ferrari. The volumes are way higher than that of Volkswagen. And then on top of that, you get services, right? And that's where
Yeah.
Apple gets 70% margins, which is double that of their hardware. So I guess my point is it is just very difficult to understand just how big Apple is. Let me just give one more statistic. Remember, I said Apple alone indirectly supports 3 to 5 million jobs in China. All Chinese demand across all industry supports between 1 and 2.5 million jobs in America. So one super corporation has more influence on jobs in China than all Chinese demand has on American jobs. I mean, wrap your head around that. This is a very big company.
We were privileged last week to have Sal Mercagliano onto our show, and he's an expert on shipping. And one of the things that he pointed out, because he was talking about China and shipping, and he said China is preparing to export all of its luxury goods to the world. And he mentioned a new ship that has just been constructed, the largest car ship that exists in the world. It carries 9,000 vehicles expressly to take Chinese cars over to global locations. And, it strikes me that North America, where we live, Canada particularly, which is part of the North American bubble, has been insulated from competition largely due to our integrated market and tariff protections. On cars, it's 104% and the like. But since early this year, that insulation is being torn down by certain political actors. I'll let you guess who. Uh, so, what do you think the global market and consumer tech outside of China looks like in 5 years based what you know about China's scale and capacity today?
I'm going to answer the question somewhat indirectly, which is to point out that to keep with the car sector, Chinese factories have the capacity to build 60 million passenger cars a year. That's two-thirds of the global market. So let's get away from the idea just for a moment that China is like a belligerent actor, an authoritarian country, a scary actor. You don't have to be anti-China to understand that that is a massive threat. It is one thing to trade with Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Germany, from the Pax Americana period, post World War II to today, where everyone participates in this sort of economic textbook David Ricardo model where comparative advantage, everyone focuses on their own thing, and we all trade to everyone's benefit, and no two countries that have McDonald's have ever gone to war. This is great stuff. It's very different to apply that to a country that is so large that any sector it deems a strategic priority, it can dominate to the extent that other nations are all deindustrialized by the impact of China. That is the current threat in EVs right now, or in automotive writ large, that China is so big and can produce these things so competitively that with the ships that you mentioned, Detroit is just deindustrialized within those 5 years that you mentioned. So that is the major threat. So you don't have to be anti-China. You don't have to be anti-CCP just to understand the mere power and size of China represents a massive threat to the trading system that we've set up over the last 80 years.
Patrick, both of us are Canadian, and I have to differentiate myself from Jon Stewart in some way here. So I'm going to use this angle right here. But speaking as a Canadian to a larger Canadian audience, because that's primarily who watches this show, this is really an opportune time to have you on because, as you know, there's a bit of a reset that's taking place in between Canada and China today. I mean, Canada expressly soured relations with China during the Huawei incident that you mentioned in your book in 2018, and similarly with the two Michaels and everything that we are familiar with that became the stuff of stories. And yet our economy right now is seeking really to counterbalance our traditional dancing partner, right? The
Yeah.
United States. So with your knowledge and your extensive experience of the Chinese government and how the economy works, what challenges do you see arising from the Canadian desired realignment, and what could that relationship look like given our geography? We don't, no matter what we may think of the politics down south, we remain situated where we are.
I have to give such a disappointing answer and just say I don't know. My book and like my research over the last 2 years has been so narrowly focused on what Apple's impact means for China and then what China's dominance in manufacturing means for the world that my big hope over the next 6 months is that I meet experts who focus on this kind of question and then I can sort of learn, mutually learn and have people read the book and get their own takes, right? That's the sort of exciting thing that I've been such a perfectionist over certain paragraphs, certain pages in the book, and then somebody applies it to their own industry. So just the other day, someone in the biotech industry was talking about the implications of my thesis for the biotech industry. Well, I don't know anything about that, but that sounds fascinating, and I would love to learn about that. And maybe that becomes an article. So yeah, I mean, look, you're absolutely right. Canada is having to rebalance and sort of seek opportunities outside of the US. And yeah, it would probably be a bit of a disaster if the focus then becomes China. And if China is being smart, and they usually are, they're probably using that as an opportunity to see if we can have closer ties. So I would worry about that, but I do not have a coherent answer about it. And so I don't want to sort of just make one up on the spot.
I'm not sure that there's any world expert that could. I think just to really kind of promote the name of our podcast, I think it's a brave new world kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think that everything would be a hedged guess, no matter which expert we brought on in that regard, but a very, very interesting dynamic. Um, you know, One of the fascinating things that I think you were alluding to throughout the book is the role of really industrial statecraft. Because what you're talking about here is not just a manufacturing base, not just a consumer base, not just about cheaper goods. It's almost the future of what drives state power. I mean, we're seeing this now in war. We're seeing this now in the Ukraine. We're watching what happens when you can match innovation and scale together, right? That's what the recent attack against Russia's bomber fleet was. It was being able to produce at scale innovative products and ultimately with a very fast production time and quality products to boot. China has a natural edge in that very area. Can you speak to that? Because really, I see your book as more than Apple, more than China. This is about global power dynamics at its core.
Yeah, and this is among the things I'm most interested in terms of what can we learn, what can we replicate from Chinese industrial policy. Because our industrial policy for most of the 20th century was that we don't have any, and that's a superior model. I mean, there is a movie from the late 1990s called, is it The Means of Production? Uh, Something like it's a Marxist phrase. And the thesis is basically that America, by not planning anything, really overrules the Soviet Union, and that's going to set us up on a great course, right? It's not so dissimilar from the caricature of Francis Fukuyama, if you will. Um, but we're now against a rival who has very thoughtfully considered our short-term corporate thinking and is playing its famously long-term strategic thinking against that. I think it's really interesting that China has a model of capitalism that does not prioritize shareholder returns, does not prioritize profits. It prioritizes command and control of entire sectors. And by taking that command and control, other people are squeezed out. And what's interesting about my narrative is that Apple takes advantage of that in ways that could prove to be very short term. In other words, over the last 10 years, the iPhone has become more Chinese in the sense that companies like Foxconn, Pegatron, Wistron, and Quanta, who were instrumental to Apple's rise in the first 20 years of the 21st century, are actually being actively squeezed out by companies that the Taiwanese call the red supply chain, Luxshare, Goretech, BYD, and Wingtech. This is just the assembly giants, by the way. This is same is true of basically any component you can really think of, TSMC chips excluded. So it's working well for Apple because those companies can work with the state to get pools of labor, to get free machinery, to get land deals, and so forth. And to quote a Foxconn official in the book, the faucet for Foxconn and the Taiwanese is being cut off. So there's state support for the red supply chain. And because they have those political deals, the political capital, they can operate at lower margin, which means that Apple is favorably giving them deals and Apple is getting higher margin. So the peak year for iPhone sales is 2015. Apple has not made any progress in unit sales for the last decade, but they do sell the more expensive phones and they do sell them at higher margin. And so there's a mutual exploitation going on here, if you understand what I'm saying, because Apple is getting more margin and better sort of steady and political points from working with more Chinese companies. But the Chinese are the ones who are getting all of the experiential know-how. And in the long term, that may prove to be far more valuable than ethereal profits. I guess there's a couple ways of saying it, but like profits to shareholders is a pretty narrow measure to judge success in like a century's worth of hindsight, let's say. It's really good at the time. It doesn't prove all that lasting.
Well, you're also comparing apples to oranges because what you're comparing is the benefits that a single corporate entity, however big, is getting versus the entirety of a country pulling its entire population out of poverty over a course of 20 years. These are not
Yes.
comparable things.
And it's worth knowing that America used to think this way until maybe the 1970s. So not to give a sort of whole history here of America, but Alexander Hamilton has a famous paper arguing that America needed to get involved in manufacturing and that it would cement the nation. Um, in the Civil War, the North doesn't have the gun culture that the South has, but they're able to manufacture guns at around 30 to 1. So it's the industrious capacity that plays an instrumental role for the North winning the Civil War. In World War II, Hitler is terrified at America entering the war because of their industrial capacity. And people will remember that, Detroit is called the arsenal of democracy. We willingly gave that up for a paradigm of shareholder first capitalism, espoused by the University of Chicago Economics School and Milton Friedman in the 1970s. They basically said the only thing a business needs to do is focus on profits. I think that is coming back to bite us. I think it's done wonderful things in terms of building up Apple and Nvidia into $3 trillion companies. But there's been a massive transfer of state power from America to China, and we willingly gave it away. I mean, my line about Tim Cook going to Zhongnanhai and saying we're going to invest $275 billion into Chinese factories over the next 5 years is that this was music to the ears, I'm quoting someone, to Beijing, because for the last 25 years, they'd been trying by hook or by crook to understand intellectual property and experiential know-how They had the Thousand Talents program, pretty arduous effort to bring in experts to China. Obviously, they were stealing at various points and so forth. But here was America's most iconic company playing the role of Prometheus, gifting the Chinese the gift of fire.
It's just honestly how you came up with this thesis. Can I ask you just how you just as an aside? I'm dying to speak about more global politics, but how did you did you start with an exposition of Apple and you just said, I just want to see what went on here? Like when did you uncover this this nexus that took place? Was that what you set out to try to figure out, or was it something that came naturally as you did your research?
No, I didn't know that when I started. So I would say maybe two things. One is that the impetus of the book was just that there really hadn't been an Apple history in the 21st century, which feels like a strange statement. But anyone listening to the show right now, thinking they're contradicting me, every book you're thinking of right now is a biography.
That's
There have
right.
been great biographies of Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive. There's a bad one of Tim Cook, but that's been the attempt. There hasn't actually been a history that takes you from near bankruptcy in 1996 or 1997, the comeback of Steve Jobs, all the way to a $1 trillion company, and that tells you product by product how they did it. I think the reason there isn't that history, by the way, is that my favorite saying about journalism is we cover all of the plane crashes and none of the landings. And a story that's just called The Triumph of Apple isn't a good story. There's no tension there if you're just looking product by product at how they pulled it off. Looking at the manufacturing angle was the sort of differentiated thing that was going to separate the narrative from other magazine takes or whatever on Apple, because I understood that we weren't covering what I a position called manufacturing design engineer or MD at Apple. These are the people who go by the plane load over to Asia and train, what ends up being millions of workers, sort of engineering 101 to conjure into reality the products that Johnny Ive and team had conceived. So I knew that, but I wasn't thinking he was on the level of a nation builder. I suppose one thing you could do is look at the articles I published in early 2023 in the Financial Times. The first one is called How Apple Bound Its Fortunes or Tied Its Fortunes to China. And I haven't reread those articles recently, but I think you'll see there is an inkling that this has transformed China, but I don't know the extent of it. And it was those articles that had a bunch of people that had Apple experience reach out to say, you're like just scratching the surface of a massive story. And it was someone at Foxconn, for instance, who said, Patrick, if you take a year off and you uncover all the stories that are in the Apple Foxconn China relationship and turned it into a movie, that was my original idea. It could run hour after like one hour a night for 40 nights because that's how much material there is. That was someone at Foxconn. That kind of blew my mind, and it helped me take a sort of, Kierkegaardian leap of faith that if I just put the effort in, it would all work out. And it did, like, beyond my wildest imagination. I spoke to more than 200 people with Apple experience, including some current people, mostly former. And it wasn't just the quantity of people, it was the caliber of people in terms of their brilliant insights or how in the weeds and on the ground they were. And so if the book is brilliant, it's really not me. It's just that Apple hires brilliant people. And if you can get them to talk, they've got crazy good stories. And then I just had to compile them. I mean, my job was just someone that had to structure what I was already told.
Yeah, that might be the case, Patrick, but you'll permit me to just say that those brilliant people have been around for 20 years and yet your book hasn't. So,
Sure.
don't sell yourself short there. Um, may I ask one more political question and then one personal question, and then we'll call it because my 45 minutes are coming to an end.
Sure.
Um, I actually want to talk about Trump and his tariffs, which is something I try to shy away from, except for how it affects Canada, because I saw them as a remarkably stupid policy that really was devoid of an understanding of basic economics. But on a macro level, on a much higher level, it strikes me that perhaps Trump is itching, having read your book, and only because I've read your book, it strikes me that perhaps what Trump is itching at and getting at in the entirely the wrong way is the fact that we need to start fighting for our manufacturing base. Now, I mean, he says so pretty explicitly, and regardless of his misunderstanding of trade versus, the differential between imports and exports and everything else, what he's actually saying is, I want manufacturing back in this country, and in doing that, there's an implicit understanding that it has value, and as you suggest, that perhaps has not been at the top of our minds for many decades. Do you
Yeah.
think that this is the beginning? Okay, I don't think Trump is the guy who's going to pull this off, and I don't think the way he's proceeding is going to help. But there's going to be people after Trump, if for no other reason than the Big Macs. And that being the case, um, do you think that this is the start of a new political sensitivity towards North American industrialization or reindustrialization? Is this going to be part of our politics going forward?
I love these big questions. They're tough to answer though. Look, so often, as is the case with Trump, there's some inkling of truth there that you could agree with, but then he takes it in a direction where the vast majority of people, including Republicans, wouldn't take it, and then it's tough to parse out like what you agree with the wild other things that he's trying to do. So, where I agree with Trump, I would love to see a reindustrialization of America. I really do think we have to have a hold over certain manufacturing. But where I disagree with him is the other 95%, which is that what you would need to compete is NAFTA on steroids. We have to take advantage of the fact that we have a developing country as a neighbor to the south, which can sort of rival China, rival India to certain degrees, right? By becoming a manufacturing powerhouse in its own right. And we have to understand that while it's sad and it's not great for jobs when a factory in Ohio closes, it matters where that factory goes. If it goes to China, all is lost, essentially. China just takes over and we don't really have any trade with them. If it goes to Mexico, there's often 25% of intermediary good trade between that factory and America. So, sorry that this is such an American thing, but that's where I live and that's where I focus on. But it's the same with Canada, right? The automotive industry is a great example of three nations in particular trading back and forth to create a bunch of cars. And you could have an electronics industry that does that. So we have to stop thinking of Mexico as like an enemy and just a place where jobs go, and more like an asset, because North America as a region where you're going to have localization within a bigger world of globalization really matters if it's competitive. And frankly, just to put this in like MAGA terms, the more successful Mexico is as a manufacturer, the fewer people there would be trying to flee the country to get to the United States. If there's opportunity in Mexico, it works out really well, even if you're an isolationist who doesn't want people into the country, right? I'm
Right.
just trying to put this in MAGA terms. This isn't how I think about it. But people fleeing Honduras, for instance, would be going to Mexican factories if there were a bunch of jobs there, rather than going even further. So I think there are sort of ways that would align with the current administration that I think would make sense. There's more in your question, but what else haven't I answered?
No, no, you gave a very comprehensive answer. And I'm going to ask you just a question about yourself as a final question, if you don't
Okay.
mind, because you got to where you are, Financial Times, this incredible book, and the accolades that come with this brilliant reporting. And you started at a religious studies degree.
Yeah.
Can you tell me, for the kids out there
Yeah.
who are started out, how can you tell me how your career progressed from religious studies to where you find yourself today?
So for 4 years of studying that at University of Toronto, I had to answer the same question, which is no, I'm not going to be a priest. I didn't study theology, which is what people always assume. I studied religion from the perspective of an atheist, which is to say I studied anthropology, psychology, and sociology of religion. Another way of saying I studied religion as a lens to look at other stuff. I mean, if you don't think that there's a God or angels or anything supernatural happening on the planet, then my God, is religion interesting because everybody else around you does believe in that stuff and wars are fought over it, right? So the study of religion from an atheist perspective is absolutely fascinating. It's a wonderful undergraduate degree. It's great for cocktail parties. It's wonderful to look at art history. It gives you a sense of, the basis of Western literature. To give a shout out to Northrop Frye, University of Toronto, someone who would say like all Western literature ultimately traces back to the Bible. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting stuff in the study of religion. The big trouble that I'm leading up to here is that you don't graduate with any job prospects. I mean, unless you're going to go to graduate school, which was kind of my plan, but I wanted to take a gap year, nobody is trying to hire you. There are no classified ads that say needed religion majors, right? And so I guess the trouble or what happened is that all I really knew from my university years, because I really geeked out, I didn't do any internships, was that I was really into reading books, thinking about big ideas, and writing stuff. Well, that's kind of the basis of journalism. right? So I basically fell into journalism. And so, in a sense, I would say a degree in religion is actually a pretty good basis for getting into journalism. And then journalism teaches you the practical skills. So I began to cover macroeconomics just before the Lehman Brothers crisis. And so I was able to sort of follow that for a while because obviously that was a world-shaking event. And that led me to the Wall Street Journal, and that led me to Hong Kong, which is where things took off with the Financial Times, and I ended up studying Hong Kong, then supply chains in Germany, covering the automotive industry, covering the Volkswagen crisis, and then covering Apple. And then when you sort of take China, supply chain, and Apple together, you sort of form the basis of my book.
Well, however you got here, and you were pretty detailed on that. I am insanely grateful. I'm also incredibly grateful for the time you've given. I've been watching you on the shows. I've been reading reviews of your book. I think everyone is blown away by what you've actually managed to stitch together, not just because of the story and not just because of the thesis, but also because of what it portends for our future. I think it's a very telling and interesting way of actually structuring what, in your own mind, what is coming next. So thank you sincerely for it. Thank you for your time today. I would invite you back on any time that you would like. And really, I'm incredibly grateful.
Episode 4, right? So good luck with the remainder of the podcast.
Thank you so much.